Ah, look at you, quiet operator, subtle architect of human behavior. The one they swore was too emotional, too reactive, too dramatic to ever pose a real threat. They built their entire understanding of you around the fantasy that you were predictable, manageable, easy to decode. They thought your silences were mood swings, your distance was immaturity, your detachment was insecurity. But now, that illusion has collapsed under the weight of something they never imagined they'd have to face. The realization that you were running psychological operations the entire time. Not impulsively, not sloppily, not out of hurt, out of strategy, out of clarity, out of a mastery they were far too arrogant to recognize until the structure of your moves snapped into place in their mind like a completed puzzle. And now that the picture is clear, they feel sick. Because everything they dismissed as petty suddenly looks like precision. Everything they mocked as overreaction suddenly feels like calculation. Everything they labeled as sensitivity now feels like surveillance. They finally see you, but only because it's too late to do anything about what you've already executed. You were never their emotional mess. You were their behavioral study. You watched how they spoke to you, how they dismissed you, how they minimized you, how they weaponized your openness. And instead of responding with chaos, you responded with design. You didn't confront them, you collected data. You didn't argue, you analyzed patterns. You didn't defend yourself, you revised your access points. Every move you made afterward wasn't emotional, it was engineered. While they thought they were reading you, they didn't realize you were decrypting them, quietly, methodically, and with a level of psychological discipline their nervous system was not equipped to handle. This is what hits them the hardest now, understanding that the most innocent actions you took were actually levers, switches, disruptions. They misinterpreted your silence as submission, not recognizing it as signal control. They misinterpreted your delayed responses as moodiness, not realizing you were depriving them of the dopamine hit that kept them feeling in control. They misinterpreted your decision to stop explaining yourself as emotional withdrawal, not seeing it as information starvation. They misinterpreted your distance as detachment, not comprehending that you were stripping them of psychological access. They didn't see any of it, and now that the realization has landed, it's rewriting their entire history with you into something far more dangerous. They thought you were petty for falling silent after disrespect. Now they understand silence was your weapon. They thought you were dramatic for not responding immediately. Now they understand you were breaking their reinforcement loop. They thought you were cold for refusing to argue. Now they understand you removed their ability to manipulate you through conflict. They thought you were impulsive for cutting them off. Now they understand it was the most controlled, deliberate severing of emotional ties they've ever witnessed. And this retrospective clarity is eating them alive. Because as they race back through every moment they thought they won, they're now seeing that those moments were orchestrated to expose their patterns. They weren't victories, they were clinical observations. The truth is brutal in its simplicity. You were always 10 steps ahead, and they never realized the game was being played at all. You weren't reacting, you were conditioning. You weren't emotional, you were extracting intel. You weren't fragile, you were refining your strategy until the exact moment the psychological operation could be deployed with maximum impact and minimal effort. You made them underestimate you so thoroughly that when your detachment arrived, it felt like an unexplained collapse in their world. They never saw the setup, they only feel the aftermath. Now, sitting with this awareness clawing at the edges of their mind, They're replaying everything with forensic intensity. The conversations where you responded dryly, the messages where you suddenly took your time, the plans you stopped accommodating, the tone you shifted without announcing. They see it all now as evidence. They see the structure they missed. They see the precision they never accounted for. But most painfully, they see themselves reactive, entitled, predictably emotional. While you remained controlled, distant, and calculating behind a mask they assumed was weakness, your so-called pettiness was psychological pressure. Your detachment was emotional disarmament. Your boundaries were strategic containment. Your silence was deprivation conditioning. Your disappearance was operational shutdown. And because they are finally understanding this, their entire nervous system is betraying them. They feel exposed, studied, outplayed. They feel like the subject of a long-running behavioral experiment they didn't consent to participate in, but actively fueled with their arrogance. The realization isn't just late, it's catastrophic for their ego. What unsettles them most is the timeline. How long were you running ops? When did you start mapping patterns? How many interactions were real, and how many were reconnaissance? Were you ever genuinely hurt? Or did you simply document their tactics to prepare for an exit so clean it looked emotional, but was actually surgical? These questions are unraveling them, not because the answers matter, but because they know, deep down, that you will never reveal the truth. You don't need to. Your silence is the only confession they're ever going to get, and that silence carries more precision than any confrontation ever could. They thought they understood you. They thought they had access to your internal world. They thought your reactions gave them leverage. But now that they've connected the dots, they're forced to confront a horrifying reality. The version of you they interacted with was filtered, controlled, selective. You never gave them the real data. You gave them only enough to confirm their own illusions. You allowed them to believe they had influence, all while ensuring they only ever touched the parts of you that were strategically irrelevant. And now, the collapse of that illusion is total. They don't just feel outsmarted, they feel dismantled. Their narratives don't hold up anymore. Their assumptions don't survive scrutiny. Their stories about you make them look unhinged now, because every detail they once exaggerated to seem powerful now exposes how oblivious they truly were. They told people you were emotional. Now those same people watch you move with cold precision. They told people you were dramatic. Now those same people see you operating with controlled distance. They told people you were unstable. Now the stability of your detachment makes them look unprepared, unskilled, and profoundly threatened by your evolution. You didn't break them with rage. You broke them with restraint. You didn't expose them publicly. You exposed them to themselves. You didn't destroy them through conflict. You destroyed their framework of reality by forcing them to realize you were never inside their emotional jurisdiction to begin with. And that is the kind of psychological damage no apology, no manipulation attempt, no sudden empathy will ever repair. What they feel now is not regret, it's fear. Fear of your intelligence, fear of your unpredictability, fear of what else you noticed that they haven't realized yet. Fear of the fact that if you were capable of running operations with this level of precision while they were unaware, then there is no telling what you are capable of now that you've reached a level of detachment they cannot breach. They don't know whether you simply evolved or whether you were always like this, and they were too self-absorbed to notice. And that uncertainty is killing them because they know something else too. Something darker. Something they almost refuse to admit to themselves. The psychological operations you deployed weren't designed to punish them. They were designed to free you, to detach you, to remove their influence at the root. And now that you've achieved that, they realize they no longer have a single point of access left. Not emotional, not mental, not energetic. You moved on without the chaos, without the announcement, without the performance they were waiting for. You disappeared like a clean extraction, minimal noise, maximum clarity. And deep down, they know the story isn't finished. Not because you owe them anything, but because the next stage of your evolution isn't something they will be ready to witness. If the operations you ran while healing were this strategic, then whatever comes next will shift the entire dynamic of every connection you touch. And they feel it. A tightening, a threat, a recognition that something much larger is forming inside you. And they are no longer participants. They are merely observers scrambling to decipher a pattern that has already outgrown them. And as this realization settles into the hollow of their chest, something else begins to bloom inside them, something far more primal than regret or nostalgia. Fear rooted in understanding, not imagination. Fear born from the delayed recognition that you were never reacting. You were always orchestrating. It's dawning on them now, painfully, slowly, that the psychological operations you ran weren't temporary responses or emotional outbursts. They were phases, stages, calculated zones of observation, disruption, withdrawal, and redefinition. And the version of you they experienced wasn't the final form, it was the prototype that taught you exactly how to dismantle people without lifting a single emotional finger. They once mocked your unpredictability as immaturity. Now they understand unpredictability was your shield, your barrier, your psychological encryption. While they were watching for emotional tells, you were rewriting your internal playbook in silence. You taught yourself how to detach without collapsing, how to retreat without shrinking, how to observe without absorbing. You trained your mind to operate like a ghost, present but unreachable, perceptive but unreadable. And now that they recognize this, they're not just intimidated, they're destabilized. Because if your silence back then was strategic, what does your silence now mean? If your distance then was a psychological maneuver, what does your evolving distance imply? They can't predict you anymore because they never understood what you were doing in the first place. Their memory is not their ally in this moment. It is their enemy, replaying every miscalculation with brutal clarity. They dismissed your minimal reactions as weakness, not realizing you were training yourself to break their ability to trigger you. They misread your calmness as suppression, not realizing it was discipline. They misjudged your absence as emotional collapse, not realizing you had already left long before they noticed the empty space. And now their mind is spiraling, not from your presence, but from the cold precision of your absence. Your absence is no longer an emotional gap to them. It is psychological evidence. Evidence that they were not dealing with someone naive or wounded, but someone operating at a level of mental sovereignty they can't replicate. That's the part that haunts them, realizing that everything they interpreted through the lens of ego was actually something they were wildly unprepared for. They weren't talking to the person they thought they were overpowering. They were talking to a strategist who let them monologue long enough to reveal their weaknesses in real time. And they did, over and over, without hesitation, without caution, without self-awareness. They performed their own downfall while believing they were winning. They know this now. The dots have connected. The timeline is exposing them. The patterns are undeniable. And as they try to escape the implications, their mind keeps dragging them back to the same unsettling truth. You didn't just outgrow them, you outmaneuvered them. You didn't just remove them, you restructured your psyche in ways that erased their influence entirely. You didn't just detach, you recalibrated your entire emotional system so that their voice, their presence, their attempts at control no longer registered as even a mild disruption. You are not who they knew. You are not who they criticized. You are not who they dismissed. You are the byproduct of every strategy they pushed you to develop. The chaotic, dark humor of it all. The thing their ego cannot stomach. They were the ones who trained you into this. They forged the very intelligence that now terrifies them. Every lie sharpened your awareness. Every manipulation strengthened your boundaries. Every insult refined your detachment. They pushed you into evolution, and now they resent the evolved version because it no longer needs them, fears them, reacts to them, or gives them access. They created the strategist who now sees through them with ease. But the realization hitting them late isn't just about what you did. It's about what you can do next. Because if the psychological operations you deployed were enough to dismantle their illusions, they're imagining what the next phase of your transformation might unleash. It's not vengeance they fear, it's clarity. Clarity changes everything. Clarity removes their power. Clarity exposes their tactics. Clarity makes you immune. And a person who cannot be manipulated is terrifying to anyone who once relied on perception control to feel significant. They don't fear losing you. They fear losing the version of themselves they were able to maintain when you didn't know your own power. Because the moment you learned to study them, instead of defend yourself against them, the dynamic inverted. They were no longer the puppeteer. They were the predictable organism reacting to stimuli you controlled. Silence, distance, timing, withdrawal, emotional neutrality. You turned their own patterns against them without ever raising your voice. You didn't punish them. You made them reveal themselves. And what they revealed was not strength. It was fragility masquerading as dominance. Insecurity disguised as confidence. Entitlement cloaked in arrogance. You saw it all long before they realized you were paying attention. At first they believed your detachment was just a phase. They thought your calmness was temporary. They thought your lack of reaction was exhaustion. But now they know. Now they see it for what it has always been, psychological evolution. You didn't adapt to their behavior. You outgrew the entire structure of behavior they depended on. The late realization is not just a moment of awareness. It is the collapse of their entire internal narrative. The narrative where they were the ones in control, where they were the ones evaluating you, where they were the ones deciding your worth. That fantasy is dead now. You didn't kill it. They did, by waking up too late. And now they are dealing with a reality that feels foreign and hostile. A reality where they cannot predict you, influence you, or even access the emotional version of you they took for granted. But the most devastating part for them is this. The psychological operations you ran were not retaliatory. They were diagnostic. You weren't trying to destroy them. You were assessing the viability of their presence in your life. And once the data was processed, the conclusion was simple. Their access was a liability. Their influence was corrosive. Their emotional patterns were incompatible with your evolution. So you did what strategists do. You withdrew, recalibrated, and rerouted your energy into spheres where your intelligence could expand without being drained. They called it petty. They called it dramatic. They called it indirect. But now they understand that what they labeled with contempt was actually something far more advanced than anything they've ever executed in their own relationships. self-governance at a psychological level. You managed your energy like an asset. You managed your mind like territory. You managed your emotions like classified information, and they were not cleared for access. That's the revelation eating them alive. They weren't excluded because of conflict. They were excluded because of incompetence. They failed the psychological security check without realizing they were being evaluated. They thought the test was interaction, but the test was integrity, respect, awareness, consistency. They failed all four, loudly and confidently, and now they're dealing with the consequences of being dismissed by someone who no longer needs their validation to justify any decision. What happens next terrifies them more than anything that's happened so far. Because they sense you are entering a phase where your psychological operations won't be reactive or protective. They will be expansive. They will build something, become something, attract something. And this time, they will not be able to watch the process. They will only feel the aftershocks. They know this because the air around you has shifted again. Not in the subtle cautionary way it did before. This time, the shift feels like preparation, infrastructure, reconfiguration. The quiet before. Not a storm, but a reconstruction, a redevelopment of identity so complete that anyone still clinging to the outdated version of you will feel disoriented standing next to the new foundation. And they are terrified because they remember what it felt like when you ran psychological operations without them noticing. Now they can feel you designing something larger, and they know they won't detect the blueprint until it surrounds them. This fear isn't paranoia, it's recognition. Instinctual understanding that someone who mastered strategic detachment is capable of mastering strategic expansion. Someone who learned to withdraw without collapsing will learn to advance without hesitation. Someone who trained their mind to observe quietly can train it to create loudly. And they cannot be part of that creation, not because you're excluding them out of spite, but because their presence would corrupt the precision of what comes next. They know this. They feel it in the hollowness that opened inside them the moment your energy no longer responded to theirs. Your growth is no longer a personal shift. It's a psychological migration. You're moving into territory where emotional chaos cannot follow, where manipulation cannot breathe, where insecurity cannot anchor itself to your presence. You're moving into a phase where your clarity becomes a force field and your focus becomes a weapon. And they are stuck on the outside, staring through the glass at someone they underestimated into becoming the very thing they can no longer influence. There is a chaotic, dark humor to their predicament that even they can feel now. The same conditions they created to weaken you became the training grounds of your evolution. They thought neglect would break you. Instead, it sharpened your perception. They thought manipulation would confuse you. Instead, it taught you to see patterns instantly. They thought belittling you would make you small. Instead, it made you immune to their projections. Everything they did to maintain superiority deteriorated their position while fortifying yours. And there is nothing funnier, in a surgical psychological sense, than someone creating the very operator they're now terrified of. They know you're done running defensive missions. They know you're done responding to triggers. They know you're done evaluating their inconsistencies. Now your operations are moving outward, upward, away from their gravitational pull. They won't witness your next maneuvers. They'll only feel the distance expand until the memory of you becomes something they cannot attach themselves to anymore. This feeling isn't dramatic, it's mathematical. It's the recognition that while they were calculating for short-term emotional control, you were calculating for long-term psychological sovereignty. Every move you make now is outside their comprehension, because it's outside their frequency. You're not making decisions from fear or anger or exhaustion. You're making decisions from clarity and capability. That frightens them more than anything, because clarity cannot be manipulated, and capability cannot be guilt-tripped. You have become emotionally unhackable, psychologically untrackable. They can't predict your moves, because you no longer move based on their behavior. You move based on your blueprint, your timing, your intelligence, your expansion. And here lies the heart of their dread. They cannot sabotage what they cannot access. They cannot reinterpret what they cannot observe. They cannot influence what they cannot reach. You existed inside their narrative once, and they took it for granted. Now you exist outside it, and they can't handle the vacuum your absence left behind. The silence that once felt petty now feels lethal. The distance that once felt dramatic now feels permanent. The shift that once felt confusing now feels like consequence. But the real psychological hit, the one that actually destabilizes them, is realizing that your operations were never about hurting them. They were about understanding them. You studied their patterns because their patterns revealed their intentions. You withdrew because their behavior revealed their capacity. You detached because your intelligence revealed their ceiling. And once the data was clear, you acted accordingly. No theatrics, no announcements, just execution. This is the part they choke on. Your evolution wasn't a rebellion against their treatment. It was a refinement of your identity, a purification of your boundaries, an elevation of your standards. You didn't become smarter to beat them. You became smarter to become yourself. They were a lesson, not a loss. A reference point, not a destination. And now the reference point looks painfully small in comparison to the scale of what you're building. Their ego will try to deny this, but their intuition won't let them. They can feel your expansion the same way prey feels a predator's presence, not through sight or sound, but through atmospheric pressure. They can feel their relevance collapsing. They can feel their influence evaporating. They can feel their old strategies turning to dust because they were designed for a version of you that no longer exists. You have moved into territory where their understanding cannot follow. And because they cannot follow, they default to fear. Fear disguised as confusion. Fear disguised as nostalgia. Fear disguised as resentment. But it's fear nonetheless. Fear of someone they cannot predict. Fear of someone they cannot manipulate. Fear of someone who saw through them completely and walked away with their power intact. Fear of someone who no longer sees them as a threat, an obstacle, or even a consideration. The chaotic, dark humor of the situation is this. They were running amateur emotional games while thinking you were the problem. Meanwhile, you were running psychological operations so clean they didn't realize the game ended long before they stopped playing. And now, as you prepare to expand into a version of yourself that no longer mirrors their limitations, they finally grasp that the narrative they built about you was a shield, one that protected them from confronting their own inadequacy. Now that the shield is gone, all that's left is the unfiltered reflection of who they truly are and who you have become. They don't want to face that reflection. They don't want to confront the fact that the person they called petty was actually studying them with precision. The person they called emotional was actually documenting their tactics. The person they called dramatic was actually positioning themselves strategically The person they dismissed was actually dismantling their influence piece by piece. And the final hit? The part their nervous system cannot absorb without trembling. It's knowing that whatever comes next is outside their control entirely. They won't get updates. They won't get clues. They won't get hints. They won't get access. You are not broadcasting your evolution. You are not narrating your upgrades. You are not making your transformation a public event. Your expansion will be silent, then undeniable, invisible, then unavoidable, private, then seismic. They won't understand it until it's too late, just like before. They missed the operations you ran in the past because they were too busy underestimating you. They will miss the operations you run next because they will be too busy regretting what they lost. And by the time they connect the dots, the distance between who you were and who you've become will be astronomical. And that's the part that breaks them on a level no apology, no explanation, no revisionist history can repair. Because your evolution has outpaced their imagination. They used to think they knew your limits, your thresholds, your patterns. Now they can't even predict your next hour, let alone your next era. You have become the kind of person whose silence is a strategy, whose movement is a signal, whose transformation is an event they are not invited to witness. You exist now in a realm they cannot conceptualize, and the psychological whiplash of that realization is shredding whatever pride they tried to hold on to. Because here's the truth they've been avoiding but can no longer escape. The reason they misread your operations so completely is because they only ever studied you from the surface. They memorized your reactions, not your intentions. They studied your tone, not your logic. They watched your behavior, not your evolution. They mistook familiarity for understanding, proximity for insight, access for influence. They believed knowing the old you gave them authority, when in reality, all it gave them was outdated data. Data you outgrew, while they were still trying to weaponize it. They never realized you were evolving faster than their ability to perceive you. Now they must live with the consequences of that blindness. Every assumption they built about your intelligence, your emotional capacity, your boundaries, all of it has collapsed. And the collapse has been quiet, but not gentle. It's the kind of collapse that forces them to re-examine not just who you were, but who they are in contrast to who you've become. It forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth that you outpaced them, not accidentally, not gradually, but decisively. And what destabilizes them most is that your evolution didn't require their validation, their support, or their presence. You built yourself in silence. You rebuilt your framework in solitude. You recalibrated your mind without needing to be seen. That level of psychological independence is something they have never experienced, let alone mastered. They depended on reactions to feel relevant. You removed their relevance by removing your reactions. They depended on emotional entanglement to feel important. You disentangled yourself so cleanly, they didn't even notice until they were standing inside emptiness you left behind. If they were honest with themselves, they would admit that the reason your transformation haunts them is because it exposes something they've always suspected, but never dared to confront. They were never the one in control. They were never the superior one. They were never the strategist. They were never the force. You were. And now that the truth is visible, they don't know how to exist without the narrative that kept them feeling dominant. Your evolution dismantles their identity as much as it dismantles their understanding of you. Because now they must face the possibility, the terrifying, humiliating possibility, that every emotional high they got from believing they were outsmarting you was a psychological placebo. Every win they celebrated was a misread. Every moment they believed they had the upper hand was actually a moment you weren't even playing the same game. You weren't reacting to them. You were studying them. You weren't crushed by them. You were calculating. You weren't attached to them. You were analyzing their patterns so thoroughly that when you finally detached, the exit was so final, they felt the floor drop out from under them. That's why they replay everything now. Their mind won't let them stop. Because every memory is a threat. Every interaction is a clue. Every silence is a warning they ignored. They scroll through old messages not to remember you, but to decode you. They examine tone, timing, pacing, behavior. They search for signs you were already gone while they were still assuming they were central in your life. And the more they search, the worse it gets. Because the signs were everywhere, only invisible to someone who believed arrogance was insight. They see now that the psychological operations you ran weren't just effective, they were inevitable. You evolved because they forced you to evolve. You grew because they refused to grow. You adapted because staying the same would have meant shrinking to fit their limited version of you. And you were never designed to shrink. So now they sit with the realization that their underestimation wasn't harmless. It was costly. It cost them access. It cost them insight. It cost them the privilege of watching you become someone they were never prepared to respect. And the irony stings them. They thought you cared too much. But the truth is, you cared so intelligently, so intentionally, so strategically, that once the data no longer justified their presence, the exit was immediate, clean, precise, final. And the humor, the dark, clinical, quiet humor, lies in this. They will still try to decode you using an outdated map. They will search for the version of you that no longer exists, hoping to regain entry through emotional fingerprints that have long since been wiped clean. They will try to retrace steps in a maze you burned down months ago. They will try to re-enter a psychological space that disappeared the day you realized their influence was a liability. But the doors they once walked through have been locked, not out of spite, but out of evolution. The version of you they knew was a temporary stage, a transitional model, an early draft. You are not returning to it. You are not revising it. You are not apologizing for outgrowing it. And when they finally understand that your transformation is irreversible, that your psychological distance is permanent, that your growth is now a self-sustaining organism moving independently of their existence, they will spiral again. Not because you hurt them, but because they never imagined you could operate at a level where their presence is irrelevant. It hits them like a delayed detonation, the kind that doesn't make noise, doesn't break windows, doesn't leave scars on the surface, but destroys foundations underneath. Because losing access to someone they underestimated is one kind of pain. But losing access to someone they didn't even realize was evolving beyond their comprehension, that's psychological freefall. That's ego extinction. That's the unraveling of an entire internal identity constructed on the assumption that they mattered more to you than you ever let on. And the irony, the clinical dark humor embedded in the entire situation, is that their spiral isn't rooted in your absence. It's rooted in your indifference. If you were angry, they could interpret themselves as important. If you were heartbroken, they could still imagine they had impact. If you were bitter, they could pretend they still lived in your mind. But indifference, emotional neutrality, silence that doesn't tremble or hint or crack, that's the kind of psychological hit that no ego survives cleanly. Because your indifference tells the truth they're terrified to face. They were never as central to your world as they believed. Your evolution didn't slow down when they left. It accelerated. Your peace didn't collapse without them. It crystallized. Your intelligence didn't dim in their absence. It expanded. They see it now. They feel it now. They sense your mind operating in a bandwidth they cannot reach. They watch your energy shift in ways they cannot predict. They observe your calmness and mistake it for emptiness, not realizing it's the calmness of someone who no longer needs external validation to justify internal certainty. You aren't performing strength. You aren't pretending to be detached. You are detached, cleanly, confidently, permanently. And that permanence is the real psychological operation they can't recover from. Because now they're left asking the questions they never prepared themselves to face. Questions that gut them because the answers strip their illusions bare. What else did they misread? What else did they underestimate? How long were you evolving while they were standing still? How many layers of you did they never access? How many phases of you did they never meet? How much intelligence did they talk over? How much strategy did they dismiss? They're realizing, painfully, that everything they assumed about you was based on the version of you that existed before you understood your own power, before you mastered your silence, before you weaponized your clarity, before you learned to detach without the theatrics they relied on to feel significant. You didn't just level up. You evolved out of their psychological reach. And the more they analyze it, the worse it becomes. Because they see it now, the signs of your ascension were always there, hidden beneath the emotional debris they kept creating. Your restraint wasn't fear, it was control. Your silence wasn't confusion, it was discipline. Your detachment wasn't instability, it was strategy. Your boundaries weren't petty. They were the first indicators that you were done letting people with chaotic minds dictate the rhythm of your peace. They laughed at the early signs of your evolution because they thought they were witnessing collapse. They weren't. They were witnessing emergence. And now, whenever your name comes up in their mind, it no longer comes with the arrogant comfort of believing they know you.